Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. It is indeed showtime. Welcome in. It's On the Ledge, Ontario Politics Podcast. We are recording this episode of The Daily. Let's see, it's just 2:15 on February the 24th. Just 3 more days until everybody casts ballots. And so I would encourage you to make sure that if you don't have your voter card by now, I discovered you can go to Elections Ontario. Just put in your postal code and it will spit out the address that you're supposed to attend to if you intend to vote. And I would hope that if you're listening to this, you intend to vote. So in case you didn't get the card, that's how you do it. That's the public service announcement today from On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. Around the table today, Keit Leslie is here, Queen's Park commentator. You hear and see him at CHTV. And Tim Hudak is a former PC Ontario leader and a partner at Council Public Affairs. And that's it today. We were going to have Amanda Galbraith in, but business got in the way of the fun of the day. So Amanda had to take care of some duties elsewhere. Having said that, I told her if in the course of the recording she's free and able, she may well just jump in. So we'll leave the seat open for her at the table, and away we go. And of course, for those of you who watch on YouTube, yes, Gumby is in the room. So and you'll have to watch YouTube to figure out what that means. It was funny to me, Tim. We have a team member on SSN, on the Story Studio Network team, and she's from Mexico, and she's probably, I don't know, in her late 20s. Yeah. And we have a lot of these video meetings, and so she stopped us in the meeting and asked DT, "What's with the little green man?" And we had to explain Gumby. It was the strangest thing out there.
I was a huge Gumby fan. Keith, I don't know if you watched it growing up. So I used to watch Commander Tom.
Commander Tom, yeah.
Right, there you go. Out of Buffalo, New York, was a WKBW.
Yeah.
Gumby and Pokey and the Blockheads, that whole gang. They should bring them back. And then, of course, Eddie Murphy Gumby.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's classic. It's funny how if you actually Google Gumby, that shows up at the top of the list. That's not
Gumby, damn it. Brilliant stuff.
Yeah, and if you think we're not talking politics, remember this just harkens back to the Flintstones reference, and we get into all of that. And Rocket Ship 7 was the other show that we watched, not just Commander Tom. So
fair enough. For sure. You remember when was it Dust Mop? And he ran for president, a presidential election. I remember 1976. Dust Mop won. I think I actually wrote a letter and mailed it off to Commander Tom. My first time in politics, Team Dust Mop.
Well, going back when I was a kid, we watched the Mickey Mouse Club, and we sent the same thing in, and I won whatever it was I won. So we got tickets to the movies and all of the junk that you could eat. So it's funny when you think about how ingrained that stuff was culturally for us when we were kids. Now, you know, it's what's shorter attention span. Mom and Dad could sit you down there in front of the TV for an hour and not worry about it. Okay, well, let's see. What did you make of, I just want to kind of draw the bridge between the two platforms being released on Friday, Doug Ford in Washington, Tim, the weekend, and brings us to Monday where the Premier has, quote unquote, released a costed platform, and we'll get into that. What did you see on the weekend that caught your eye? Anything in terms of movement or where the leaders were or what was being said?
So, look, on the Ford campaign, consistent, right? So another day of Washington news. We'll talk momentarily more about the platform, but a lot in there that's related to tariffs. So I think that will help carry the day as well. I just think that this has been an extraordinarily well-run progressive conservative campaign. The Premier's performed well, but their strategic design, whether you like the early call or not, I think it's one for the record books. And to think that you could have a Premier, the third consecutive majority government, actually increasing his seats when the issue matrix was against him is phenomenal. On the New Democrats and the Liberals, I think Dave is still trying to fight it out for second. Like, who is going? Clearly, the Liberals have more votes, but the NDP vote is more efficient in certain pockets. I think it's still up in the air with which of those two leaders will emerge as the leader of the official opposition. And I think Bonnie Crombie's seat as well is on the line.
So, Keith, one of the things that I find remarkable in all of this over the last couple of weeks is the lack of obvious media coverage of the NDP campaign. And, you and I, having come from the broadcast world, there was a time when, well, you have to have balance. And it didn't mean you had to have balance in every story or in every newscast, but overall, there needed to be balance in terms of time spent covering the parties. And maybe it's just me. I've got the blinders on, but I'm actively looking for the coverage. And I don't see as much NDP coverage. In fact, I might see as much Green coverage in some days as I see NDP coverage. You get a sense of that?
I hadn't really noticed it that much, but I suppose you're not wrong. I mean, I noticed, for example, today that Merit Styles' first event wasn't until 3:30 in the afternoon. That's not going to help you get media coverage. You have to be out earlier in the day. You have to feed that beast as early as you can, quite frankly. And most of the parties do that on a fairly regular basis. The NDP do seem to be struggling for whatever reason, but at least their campaign platform, when it came out on Friday, had something different than the other campaign platforms where, Bonnie Crombie's she's got $9 billion in new spending, but, I'm not going to have to raise taxes. In fact, I'm going to cut your taxes. Whereas the NDP at least come back and say, okay, we're going to pay for our programs with tax increases on people over 300,000, people over 400,000, people under $500,000 a year. At least they're going to promise and stand by some sort of revenue generating thing to pay for their promises. Something we're not seeing from the Liberals, who are talking the same language as the PCs, which is efficiencies, and there's savings to be found within government, and I'm sure there still are. But after 7 years of PC government, I would imagine they've done a lot of red tape cutting and efficiency finding. So where are we going with this? As I say, at least the NDP should get credit for putting out a costed platform that actually includes how they would pay for what they're doing.
Yeah, as we were talking on Friday, Tim, the platform the Liberals had released was just sort of, the ink was barely dry on it. So we knew what the big numbers were, and that there was going to be the tax reductions, or no tax increases, et cetera. And it sounded, John Wright making the point, it sounded very fiscally conservative vis-a-vis the lane that they were in. But later, I saw this clip when Bonnie Crombie was questioned. I think it might have been the Canadian Press reporter, Liam Casey, and he was asking her, okay, do the math for me, because we're just journalists and we don't math.
I don't understand. We haven't spent much money on the tunnel yet, right?
Yeah, but we've spent $2 billion at Ontario Place.
The money is already gone.
Yeah, but that existed, right? There was $2 billion that left.
But aren't we talking about going forward?
We are, but I'm saying to you that money exists, had existed in the budget, right? He's given it away to speed up the sale of beer and wine. Not a family doctor, but beer and wine.
I don't know how that's.
But that money exists annually, and Liam, that money is there in the budget. It was given away, but it exists there next year as well. We wouldn't give it away. We would repurpose it to get you a family doctor and to invest in our schools and hire educators.
Okay, call me stupid. You're the economist, Tim, but I think once the money's been spent, it's really hard to get it back.
It was a bit of a who's on first routine there, right? In terms of answering that question. Look, I think the bottom line is that the platforms really were thrown together, right? There was no real strong commitment of the gate that there was going to be a costed plan. It's going to be a side comment by Bonnie Crombie during the campaign. Same with Pierre Ford. I think that's why you're seeing them late in the campaign. There's probably a crew in the back room, right, over the last 3 weeks, cobbling something together, and there's going to be holes in it as a result. All of that having been said, at least they did something. But I sense that the costed, full platform is just not a tool that voters are demanding as they did maybe a decade or so ago.
Well, yeah, it's almost an anachronism. I mean, we've mentioned this before, whether it's the debate structure itself, Keith, or whether it's a costed platform. I don't know anybody, with the exception of the crew that lives on this podcast, that came in, hey, did you hear they have a costed platform?
No, but it's one of those things that should matter. It's the same as you hear they're not participating in the debates. Well, it should matter. But a costed platform, as you say, is something we all used to look for, and we still look for, I think, to see if someone's somehow fiscally responsible, or if they're just, making promises that they really cannot pay for, or taxpayers are going to have to pay for some increased revenue from them. So I think it's important that when we saw the PC platform come out, it was almost like a mini budget or a fall economic statement, but without all that nasty, debt and deficit and all that red ink type stuff that we don't want to talk about because we're in an election campaign. So it's just about $40 billion in new spending to counter the Trump tariffs. That's a pretty big blank check. I mean, he specifies, $5 billion to help workers and companies deal with the tariff if they're imposed and other stuff like this. But for the most part, this is a 32-page boasting of what the PCs can and have done to help lower costs and with the promises they're making. There's a line in there about the 401 tunnel, but of course, there's not a dollar or penny attached to it. There's no estimates. There's no environmental studies, nothing there. Just he's going to continue with that tunnel promise, which, as one reporter pointed out in asking Doug Ford about this last week, was it's the largest campaign promise in Ontario history, the most financially impactful one. And yet we don't even know. I mean, we're hearing estimates. I heard one the other day, I think Bonnie Crombie threw it out, $200 billion. It had been $100 billion just a week or two ago. But in any event, we have no idea, but it's in there as well. So he's asking for $40 billion in a blank check. And again, not a word about what this is adding to the deficit or the debt, other than he did say, well, if the tariffs come in, we won't be balancing the budget.
Well, the reporters challenged him, Tim, saying, you want to do this because you say you respect taxpayers' dollars, but not putting a dollar attached to it, it disrespects them.
We're pretty clear that if these tariffs come, our investment is going to be over $40 billion, no matter if it's loans or other investments we have for people and businesses to make sure they're secure. If Trump's tariffs come and hit us, we've been very fiscally responsible. We're prudent fiscal managers with the taxpayers' money. Not only haven't we raised taxes, we reduced the cost of paying on debt from previous governments better than we ever have. That I can remember, probably 20 years. We just got upgraded from 2 credit agencies this year alone. Reason we got upgraded credit agencies, increased our credit, is because we're fiscally responsible. We're pouring $200 billion into infrastructure, and the credit agencies love to see money spent into infrastructure, and that's what we're doing.
In the platform, there's a new promise on alcohol, removing the minimum pricing for alcohols and spirits. Why?
Because that's the taxpayers' money. It's putting money back into people's pockets. So under the Liberals, and I got to explain to the folks in this room here, they would say you have to charge this much, because if you don't charge this much, then people will drink too much. That's the biggest joke I've ever heard. They don't do it in Alberta. They don't do it in Quebec. So why do we have to have a base? Let's reduce the cost of that, put more money back into people's pockets again, and that's like a tax break, and that's what we believe in keeping everything at a lower cost. So we're going to make sure that we reduce the cost of the fees and the tax.
But even there did not assign a number to that base cost for the bottle of spirits or whatever it might be.
No, but happy hour's back. Come on. Bars can bring happy hour back now. And they're not only, he's also increasing the bar's discount on booze from the LCBO from 10% to 15% to help them through this tough time. So clearly, if the tariffs come in, we're going to need to drink. And it's going to be made easier by the Ford government for all of us. As I say, the return of happy hour was really kind of surprising. In fact, I had to ask and make sure. I mean, if there's no minimum price on booze, that means bars can do this, right? And we checked, and sure enough, they can do this. I mean, if the minimum price on booze is removed. On the other hand, right now, apparently the minimum price for a bottle of vodka is like $31.
Yep.
So maybe we can start getting some sales somewhere on all of this. But do we want sales? Do we want Costco selling out 30 packs of beer for $12 and putting everybody else out of business for a while? These are the things that could happen when you take away the minimum price on alcohol, not to mention the whole social ramifications with other groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and that will raise, I'm sure, instantly. But just the whole financial impact of it could be substantial if the big box stores are able to, discount and push everyone out of the business like they did with every other type of business that used to exist, locally, hardware stores and whatnot. They've all been pushed out. That could happen here with the big box stores taking over, beer sales, discounting the hell out of it.
Tim?
Couple things on that. And just take it back to the fully costed platform. And I bet, Dave and Keith, that at the beginning of the campaign, none of the three parties was really planning on putting out that document. But I'm happy that they did. And maybe it's a C+ or B-. It may not be the level of sophistication we've seen in the past. But it does show that there is some pressure from voters, from the media, observers like ourselves, to actually have some genuflection towards responsibility. It's not the Chrétien era we had to prove that he was ready to govern, or Mike Harris's common sense revolution for sure. But at least this thing survives, and it's still an important enough thing to do that we're seeing all three of the major campaigns do that. With respect to the booze stuff, this just makes me happy because these are old Hudak plans. Right? Bring back happy hour. I talked about getting rid of the minimum price. I used to be lobbied when I was consumer minister by Molson, Labatt's, and Sleeman's to increase beer prices. We used to control that. We got rid of that, and then McGuinty brought in the minimum price that would go up every year, which was a stealth tax increase. So I didn't get to do it myself. I do cheer these things on. The crowd backer, by the way, Dave, was very stoic. But the young men started smiling and whispering to each other as they talked about cheaper booze. And that was a connection we made when I was leader, that it doesn't motivate votes, except tends to with young men and actually moms now, just out of convenience.
Yeah, and again, I just wonder how much, and I'm beginning to hear bigger, broader conversations around reform of our political institutions, given what we're facing vis-a-vis Trump, the tariffs, and everything. And I love that we are having these academic, pointy-headed conversations. But this, to me, Tim, what the Premier just presented, I don't have to tell you what it's going to cost. I'm here for you. I don't have to tell you what it's going to cost. I'm going to save you money at the liquor store. Resonates right away.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's amazing how what a lightning rod, alcohol is. Anytime you talk about booze, right? We go to it, the media and the audience as a result. There are a number of funds in there, though, that are wise. And fair enough, we don't know what it truly will cost. We don't know the size and scope of tariffs, how long that will last. We knock on wood and hope for the best. But they did have funds in there to bring more jobs, to help manufacturing who may be impacted by the tariffs, to keep jobs, invest in new equipment, specialized fund also for critical minerals and have them developed in our province. So the math may not be perfect given all the unknowns, but I'm glad to see something new in the platform that hadn't been talked about in detail during the campaign that's going to make sense for the government to pursue.
We talked last week as we were kind of getting ready for this final few days of the campaign, what to watch for, and ad spends, Keith, were obviously a barometer of what the parties were up to and where they were going to put their attention. Over the weekend, I noticed a whole lot more advertising on the specialty channels for sure, but a lot on my social media feeds. And Sabrina and Angie reporting this morning, the Liberals were forking over $840,000 on Meta ads over the last 30 days, and they're outspending the other two parties considerably. So, and I'm going to guess that a lot of that got invested in the last 5 or 10 days of the campaign.
Absolutely. This is where campaigning is done now. It's not, purchasing super expensive TV airtime and radio spots. It's specifically targeted to the individual voter almost. Social media buys. And it's huge amounts of money. As you said, over $800,000 by the Liberal Party. This, I think, is smart spending by them. If you harken back to the Obama's first election, they were the ones that really first took advantage of the whole social media aspect of campaigning and reaching out to voters and encouraging voters and getting them on side. And it worked so surprisingly well there that now it's a fine-honed art in 2025. So I think that's why we're seeing the Liberals being willing to spend so much, because they've had to counter all those, we've had nearly a year of PC paid-for ads attacking Bonnie Crombie and identifying her to the public who really didn't know her very well because she didn't even have a seat in the legislature. So I think this is smart spending by the Liberals. It's proving, at least in the polls so far, to be helping them, lead the distance, spread the gap between them and the NDP in this race for second place. But to Tim's point earlier, it's a matter of seeing who has the most efficient vote and who can get the most seats out of those numbers as they currently stand.
So $800,000 sounds like a lot of money to spend in the last month and so on. But I mean, I remember the day when radio stations and television stations had to give the parties specific amounts of time that when they wanted to buy. So if you were sold out, it didn't matter. You had to actually make time for the campaigns, and it was a windfall for the broadcasters. I'm going to hazard to guess that those ads cost a whole lot more money than a Facebook ad does, Tim. So they're getting more ads for their buck, and it's far more efficient. But it's interesting to me to see how, again, they can target that very specific. We're talking Meta, just Facebook and Instagram. I mean, I'm sure they're elsewhere, but That's where we live. So here's what I find interesting. On neither of those platforms is there any news. There is no Canadian news about the election, but there's all kinds of advertising about the election.
Oh, that is interesting. I didn't think about that. I did go back to something from our first week of this coverage on the Ledge. Remember, David, you talked about the Ontario taxpayer-funded ads that were being broadcast, and we had expressed our discomfort with those, and they eventually did get pulled down, right? So I got to give you credit. You're the first one sort of to call that out, and they saw your way. With respect, it is an amazing tool, right? The notion, traditionally where you would do a very expensive ad, try to hit a top show and bluntly hit your audience. And now the ability through a digital campaign to, target the young female voter who's pursuing her business degree in Toronto, or the, older male who likes trucks and being outdoors, and catering ads to them, particularly in a much cheaper way, is a phenomenal development. So no surprise Liberals are going in that direction. I think it'll probably pay off, especially in marginal seats. One thing that does surprise me, I thought I would see more appearances on podcasts, right? That was a dominant part of the American campaign with President Trump and Kamala Harris, right? Doing that. We didn't really see this in the Ontario campaign, although there was a use of influencers, things like Six Buzz, for example, that has a larger audience among young people in the GTA than CP24 does. Some news was carried through, what would you call it, alternative channels like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked about that phenomenon on Now and Next just before the campaign. And the comms crew that's on that show came to the conclusion that for the most part, where it cut through in the United States, it was on podcasts that were not political podcasts. They weren't public affairs podcasts. So there are fewer of the social sort of lifestyle programs that people were, I guess, attracted to here in Canada, Keith. And now there were some, because we did get response back from some listeners says, oh yeah, so-and-so just got a call from somebody and a politician wants to be on her show. We've got 2 shows in Story Studio Network, and by accident or design, we've got MPs and MPPs reaching out to hosts of those particular shows. Some of them are self-help. Some of them are, service-oriented programs that fit into their interest in terms of politics, but it's not talking about the politics. So there is some of that, but I just don't think that the podcast ecosystem yet is balanced enough to attract that kind of conversation. Because quite frankly, I think, I would hesitate to suggest for a second that any one of the leaders would want to come on this show.
Well, I would think they should.
That's a different thing, right?
It's a completely different thing. I think, although, as you say, our podcast network just isn't developed, I guess, in this country to the same degree. The secret weapon for Donald Trump's campaign with the podcasters was Barron Trump, telling him who to appear on, what shows to go on. Apparently, he had a much better feel for it than anyone else in the Trump campaign. And as we know, it worked to a tremendous effect for Donald Trump. In Canada, I mean, I wish it were us and, perhaps us and the Hurley-Burley and the On Poly one with Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath. There's some, these are some people doing some really serious interest politics podcasts. Laura Babcock's O Show, very opinionated politics podcast. Leaders should agree to appear on these podcasts. I don't know if you want to do it during an election campaign when, things are just so tight and your message is not going to be nearly as tightly controlled on a podcast. When you have, we can go 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes. That's not good for politicians who want to give, 5-6 minutes for you for a sit down interview and then move on and stay on their message of the day.
Yeah, I guess the whole idea of it, Tim, though, is if, beyond what we're doing, we're not going to get into this. So tell us about yourself kind of conversation, right? And that's what they would want, right? That's, if you were going to go on as leader of the Tory party, you'd want to be in an environment where you could actually tell people who are listening to the podcast more about Tim Hudak and your personal, excitements and the hobbies and all the things that you do to make you, somebody that they would recognize. And hey, did you hear about Tim Hudak? It's not necessarily because of your housing policy. You know what I mean?
I would like to think that I would have been all over this if the opportunity was there. I was the first leader, I think it was the first politician in Canada with their own app. And we actually talked about this. Some of my barbecue recipes were there, what I was doing on a fun or social side. Tried to humanize me, because when we polled on Hudak, we found out that 50% of voters did not believe I actually was human. and 25 might have some human-like tendencies. But man, this is
that's a shock to the self-awareness. Holy cow!
So but I think it still is a missed opportunity. So you're right. The lifestyle shows they won't throw the tougher questions that you would get if you were on a major broadcaster, for example. Secondly, you tend to be more relaxed, and you do come across as human, especially if it's an area that you have an interest. If you were, in gardening or biking or hiking or what have you. And I used to do a ton of these when I was CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. I should take any podcast out there, because you can get your message out. You come across as caring, and that audience, is going to be interested in what you have to say on that particular topic. And I'm still doing a lot of them at Council of Public Affairs. So I hear you. I think you're right. We don't have, anywhere. We don't have the Joe Rogan equivalent in Canada yet. I still think it's a missed opportunity, and I bet you the federal campaign you'll see a lot more of that.
Well, I'm already hearing among the federal campaign that people are starting to explore. Maybe we should be thinking about this as almost a branded piece, Keith, for a campaign, because that's again back to there's nobody on the bus because there ain't no bus.
There ain't no bus anymore. And of course, it makes sense to have your person on. And again, as I said, there's dangers in going on for 45 to 60 minutes for a politician, but there's also a lot of opportunities for their team to find a really good clip, to find one or two moments that may not necessarily be a viral moment, but they're at least a talking point moment. They, when Bonnie Crombie last week said, Doug Ford needs to have the balls to say that to my face.
Mm-hmm.
That was intentional. She knew she was going to get some attention for throwing that out there in that harsh a way. And she did. And that's what you do. You're looking for a moment, some sort of thing that, as I say, may not necessarily go viral, but at least would get some impact, get you some media play. And that particular clip got her media play right across the TV and radio spectrum. I'm sure it was probably used in the print stories as well. Why not? So this is what you have to do in this day and age, is basically anything you can to get noticed. But branding on a podcast, it shows you have the courage to sit down with people who are bound to have at least one other person on that podcast who's going to have different opinions than you, or is going to challenge you quite forcefully. And that's part of the, if you don't want to participate in public debates, sit down and engage on a podcast. I think people find them very helpful to find out, not just as Premier, do you have the power to get someone to get you a fudgesicle at 6 a.m? And I heard Dalton McGuinty get asked that one time, and I'm paying to be on a campaign bus, and I can't get an interview with the guy, and the local radio station's asking what kind of power trip he can have. But it was fun. It's a guy having a bit of fun in the morning radio, and Dalton's got to play along, right? He's got all these policy ideas jammed into his head, and they're talking to him literally about, can you order someone to go get you a fudgesicle when you want one?
Well,
but these are the
people want to know.
Well, you know something? The radio guy, he's got an audience at 6 a.m. Yep. Do they really want to hear a tough policy? No, they want to hear something a little bit. Can Dalton take a joke? That sort of, and so you get all those aspects of it. Well, in a podcast, you can get a little bit of everything, right? We can poke a joke, we can have a little bit of fun, but we can nail down to the serious stuff as well. And I think that's what people really enjoy about the podcast. You get differing opinions, and if someone says something that's blatantly bullshit, someone's going to call them on it instantly.
Just still on the media, we've talked a lot about the campaign ads. Tim, we talked about the Ontario government campaign ads rather off the top, but the third party ads, I think it's an interesting time for them, because the election was called so early and relatively quickly. We could see it coming, but they couldn't prepare their messaging either. And so I'm just starting to hear probably more of that third party, and particularly your old stomping grounds, the folks at Oria. They've been active, but last week they came out with their report card for the three parties, and Mr. Ford's team didn't do so well among your old friends at Oria.
So a couple things there. Yeah, I'd be interested to know what you hear. I think, because I'm a big news talk fan, the radio, the education unions ads the most, maybe something on healthcare, but otherwise I'm not seeing much third party, but that's because they are severely limited, right, in how much you could buy. Mm-hmm. I'd anticipate they would similarly migrate to Meta and other channels, but I wonder if they're just a bit of a step behind, because I don't think they're going to have that much of an impact this time around. What I think they do is actually the private sector union is endorsing Ford. I think that's what I've heard from PC friends. It's got a lot of boots on ground for get the vote out, identify the vote during the winter campaign. The second topic, I've wandered too much here. Sorry, what was the second topic?
Oria's report on housing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You
remember them?
I was going to forget. You delete that section. I'm happy to see that's a tool we used when I was there. And so the Ford campaign just declined to answer a number of areas, right? So they got kind of neutral symbols, whereas Liberals, Green, and NDP were actually quite strong on what Oria was asking for. Look, I think it is outstanding when you see a group like Oria that puts something on the table that is important, because housing is a crisis. The affordability crisis is deeper, but it barely got a peep in the campaign. So good for them in pushing it.
Yeah, and again, we go back to what is actually making a difference, and you would have thought that would have been one of those things that made a difference generally, but I guess it's just the overwhelming, amount of oxygen that's been taken out of the room because of the tariffs. That cuts both ways, though, in terms of helping or hurting a campaign, I would think, Keith. So, for example, we talked about Crombie trying to justify her spending numbers in her platform and kind of getting tangled up in the loop there around, do we have that money, or did we spend that money, or is it come or gone, or whatever. This week she was in Ottawa. Not surprising. There's some key ridings there. The Liberals think they can win. And part of the conversation with the media included a question from somebody from Le Devoir who had said and noted that there was a Francophone group here in Ontario who'd sent out a survey to all of the party leaders, and the Liberals were the only ones who answered back in English only. There was no French in that, so it was a little bit awkward for Crombie in both official languages.
I want to say that la communauté francophone au le cœur de l'identité ontarienne. So this was very regrettable and very unfortunate. There was a problem with the French translation, and it came a little bit later. And we regret that this has happened, and apologize profusely. Très désolé. And unfortunately, we have responded now.
And I see your sign is only in English today in Ottawa Vanier, which is a pretty big Francophone riding.
Our apologies again. We're just, this is a banner that we're using right across the province, so our apologies that it wasn't translated.
I don't know that it's a campaign breaker, but it's one of those things that just, it kills the momentum in the moment, especially in some ridings where it's going to be close, Keith.
Well, you just saw the air go out of the room there, didn't you?
Yeah.
Just literally just got sucked right out the door. That's a serious misstep. I can see it happening. We've got the English train. We just need to get it translated, and someone sent in the English only version. Can absolutely see how it happened, but but then to show up in the riding and have an English only sign, and your defense is, well, it's a sign we use across Ontario. Well, then shouldn't you have a bilingual sign as you go across Ontario? That compounded the problem, and it left Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie just flustered. I mean, what could she say there? I apologize again. I'm sorry. There's nothing she could say. I'm sure, if we had the infrared glasses on, we would have seen the steam coming out of her ears. But there's nothing she could do. There's literally nothing. That's just, some staff screw ups there. Although she herself might have noticed as she's, standing behind these podiums every day that it's an English only sign. Might have been something somebody caught 3 days before the election.
Well, I mean, to just for those who are listening, the video shows her looking over her shoulder as the reporter points out that the banner is only in English. So there's almost the body language, Tim, that says, "Oh, damn."
Yeah, it's an all around campaign fail, right? Somebody should have caught that. Every team has advance that goes, initially days, and then the day before to make sure everything is looking good. You get it staged. Somebody approves products. That's a pretty bad one, especially for the Ontario. It's bad for anybody, especially the Ontario Liberal Party that needs to keep those seats in the Francophone parts of Ottawa. For knowing that the election campaign was likely going to happen in 2025, sure, maybe a month or two earlier than people would have forecasted. A lot of sloppiness from the opposition campaigns. You look at some of the candidates that they have selected and the days of embarrassment that have come out of that as well. If we're a snap election, appreciate that, but man, was nobody trying to think these things ahead when they were told there's going to be a campaign and likelihood back in 2024.
Well, even to your point around choosing candidates, they were, even given that, they were slow getting all of their candidates lined up, and to some degree, so were the NDP. But let me ask you this: we got we're counting now hours before people cast their ballots. Does this really make a difference on the ground in that riding?
Yeah, I think it does. Actually, I think it does. Now they tend to be, they're both in Liberal hands, right? So I think they have a healthy enough margin. But as Keith said, it takes the steam out. It takes you off of a positive message you're hoping to relate. So if there are seats that are on the margin, yeah, that can hurt. I had a little incident like this. I remember. I thought Bonnie handled it well for the position she was in. Right. I thought she actually stayed calm. She apologized.
Well, she owned it. All right.
I mean, yeah. So good for her. But I remember when I first campaigned, we had this innovative tool that was called a VHS recording. It was like taking YouTube, put it in a plastic box, and you got a machine at home to use it in. And we spelled Port Colborne incorrectly. And this is the area that I had not voted Conservative. And we put an extra U in Port Colborne, and it became an issue. I lost it. But it was terribly embarrassing as a candidate when you have that kind of flub. And it does undermine your morale.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's a self-inflicted wound, own goal, or whatever you want to call it, at a time when you can't be in that place. But Ottawa's getting a lot of attention from that perspective in terms of just some of those fights on the ground where the Liberals may or may not be in play there, Keith, and that could mean the difference between official party status or not. Hamilton, and you had flagged this considerably early, maybe even before the campaign, that it was in play in terms of how well the Tories were doing there.
It still is. Although the NDP, the latest poll showed the NDP are getting a little bit of their feedback in Hamilton, Niagara area, which is, normally a good stronghold for them. They don't own all the ridings, but they have a good stronghold. But yeah, Hamilton is absolutely in play. I mean, Hamilton Mountain, there's some nasty fighting going on up there. Hamilton Center with Sarah Jama running against, the former NDP MPP running against the NDP. So there's all these candidates on the progressive side that Dave, you pointed out, they could split that progressive vote enough ways that the PCs could take Hamilton Center, which would be a huge shock. I mean, last time they took Hamilton East Stony Creek, they've got several others. The PCs and the NDP are really battling it out in Hamilton and Niagara area. And I think it's going to be really interesting. Apparently, there's some tighter races happening now in Eastern Ontario as well, which is why we're seeing the candidates go to Ottawa. But the Hamilton-Niagara thing is going to be really something to watch on Thursday evening and see just, who's got the momentum early on. Can they hold it? And are there any ridings going to flip? Or are they going to stay, as solid as? I mean, we've got some really solid veteran MPPs in the area, and can they hold on to their ridings, or will they flip? Is there a tide that's going to, dent the Ford government or not? We'll see it in the Hamilton-Niagara area first, I think.
And then there's southwestern Ontario, which has sort of been London was always one of the London ridings. I can't remember which one. That was always the bellwether, Tim. So there was things to watch in southwestern Ontario. But again, that's a lot where the PCs and the NDP are fighting it out.
Again, I think the PC campaign has been exemplary. And I talked about the strategy earlier, but even on the ground. So, yeah, they're going to have more troops. I mentioned the private sector unions, but they also have more political staff who take a leave and basically are full-time campaign workers. So remember that game Risk? David and Keith probably played it. Yeah. So they've gotten all these little blue chips. They're deciding where in the map to place those chips. They actually have somebody in their campaign who's evaluated the ground troops and what are the target seats. So you named some of them, right? They want to win in Windsor West and knock off Lisa Gretzky. Niagara Center, they feel very confident about taking that from Jeff Birch and the NDP. A couple of the Hamilton seats are in place. So they're actually putting the risk pieces in those areas. And I think it tells you a couple of things. First, Ford has strong appeal to what may have been sort of my grandfather's NDP voters. Good for him. Andrea Horwath did have a boost. She gave a boost to her candidates in Hamilton, Niagara area. She's no longer there, so they don't have that Horwath glow from her leaderships. My last point, I think the biggest surprise of the campaign to me has been that Marit Stiles hasn't taken off. I think she's a good communicator. She's energy. She, comes across well on camera. But their campaign just seems to be so diffuse that it's not cutting through. And some of those orange seats are going to go blue as a result.
Yeah, but even we talked about last week where she was lining up all of her 9 MPPs from Toronto in Toronto to campaign on what were thought to be strong, first of all, strong candidates. They've been strong members, but also strong seats for them. The margin in Toronto is still up and down. And I thought, was it Friday, Keith? I was looking at the Nanos numbers, and for the first time in the campaign, the Liberals had the biggest chunk of the public support, but second to was were the Tories, and the NDP dropping down to the mid-teens in Toronto.
Yeah, the Liberals seem to be absolutely making some strong gains in Toronto. And I think you're going to see, again, here's a surprise, battleground 905. And it's going to be really, really tight. But I think the Conservatives, they're in such a strong position heading into this one in the 905 area. I think, Liberal gains in Toronto will be offset. I don't think they can, they might get to official party status, but they're not going to, in any way hold the Ford government to a minority government. I just don't see it happening. We saw the early voter turnout. Now, there's only 3 days in this election instead of 5 or 10 as there normally is in a normal writ period. But only 6% of the people came out and voted. 6% of eligible voters took advantage of the 3 days of advance voting. But in many parts of the province, including Toronto, it was difficult to get out and walk around and get to your polling station. So that might have as well, really lowered the voter turnout. So we don't know what we're going to see on Thursday. The weather's forecast for most of the province to be better, much better. So hopefully a lot of that stuff ice and snow will be carved away or melted away or pushed away, and people will be able to walk out and vote. But right now, it seems concerning to see that low of a voter turnout. It seems to be exactly what the government would have wanted. They ran a very smooth, easy campaign, as Tim talked about. They stayed focused on the tariffs. They didn't get sidetracked very much at all. And here we have a government that just, no matter what comes out in the polls, they've been above 40%. And as John Wright will tell us every time, that's a solid majority government.
Well, and Keith, Tim, the interesting part of that number too is that it hasn't really shifted. So we have seen the Liberals making gains at the expense of the NDP. But if you talk about the seat gains, it sounds as if the Tories are going to make seat gains at the expense of the NDP.
Just truly incredible, right? And a third majority government, there was already a large majority to actually increase your seats. And it's a credit to the campaign, the focus on the issues, the strategic decision to time it as they did, but also disappointing performance by the New Democrats, who had, 2 consecutive times in official opposition, a chance to solidify that or potentially move to government.
Mm-hmm. Just before we go, Keith and I were talking about this just before we came on. Tim, just wanted to get your take on this. The idea that the federal Liberals are having 2 leadership debates, one tonight and one tomorrow night, French-English. And, Keith brought up the point, what the hell's the rush? Why wouldn't you just wait until the election's over and then do that when you're free and clear? And I don't know if there's a thought in there. Well, this just might help the Liberals in Ontario if we're talking and saying good things about Liberals in Ottawa.
So political parties of the same stripe are not brothers and sisters. I'd say they're not even cousins. They're more like second cousins. And they'll see each other at family reunions and that sort of thing from time to time. But when it comes to an election campaign, it's every person for themselves, and those thoughts don't play into it. Dave, I remember when we were in opposition, we didn't get as much help as we hoped federally, and then vice versa. When we were in government, we didn't send the troops to help out nationally. In fact, Doug Ford, I think, told his team not to get involved in the most recent provincial campaign under O'Toole, because you want to focus on winning. At the end of the day, it's not the bloodline that counts. It's winning or losing election campaigns. So you damn the torpedoes and do what's going to help you win. And let your cousins fend for themselves.
So if you were in the Liberal war room, are you swearing at the feds for having their debates then tonight and tomorrow?
Geez, I think maybe, but I suspect a lot of the talent, right, has gone at the federal level, and they're getting involved in leadership campaigns and didn't back up the provincial as much. And, resources be pulled and donation be pulled in that direction. So I think by this time, Dave, you've come to accept this fact, and you just try to soldier on. I do wonder, and this is something you probably asked John, or you will, with the Liberals bounce back federally, is that buoying the provincial numbers? And Jagmeet Singh's very poor performance federally, is that holding down the NDP in the provincial polls? Are they actually a bit closer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it probably cuts both ways in terms of that stuff. So anyway, we'll be back at this with our regular crew, including Tim Hudak and Keit Leslie and John Wright, on our Thursday edition. It'll be the Election Day show. We will do a show, and I want to get your thoughts and your insights on exactly what's going on a TikTok timeline thing in terms of what goes into getting the vote out on a day when the weather's crappy or whatever it might be, Tim, to make sure that, the team is energized and ready to go. So I'll be curious to get that view. And we'll just kind of do a wrap on the whole thing Thursday, and then Friday we'll do our final wrap of the campaign, and that will be it for On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, the daily edition. Tomorrow we're going to get into housing, and we're going to talk specifically about housing. And Neil Hetherington is going to be here. Pedro Batara from the Habitat for Humanity. I'll get it out of me. He's going to be here with us, along with Gerard Kennedy. And they've all had experience in terms of, the poverty files. How do we get housing? How do we deal with those things to make sure that all of these things are integrated? And I realize that, housing didn't get the conversation it probably should have had, but I think tomorrow will be an important way to sort of set the tone in terms of what to expect moving forward in terms of the expectations around affordable housing and how it can be done. So Pedro Barada, Neil Hetherington, and Gerard Kennedy on tomorrow's show. And then on Wednesday, we've got our cast, our comms and strategy team in here to wrap things up before we hit Election Day with Tim, John, and Keith. So thanks for being here. This is the Monday edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, 3:00 as we sign off. So things may have changed by the time you hear this. So long. Talk to you tomorrow.
This is SSN
Story Studio Network.